Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our evening seminar. Today we have a really interesting talk by two guest speakers, the both police officers. We have John Daly and we have Lee Hill from the Met. They're going to introduce what they do in terms of what they do for the day job. But what I wanted to share with you is that they're both graduates of our police executive program. And they've done marvelously on their research. And they were asked to come back and to present very interesting, insightful findings on an area of policing that's been gaining a lot of traction in recent years, and that's focused deterrence. Practically speaking, officers trying to prevent crime before it happens and take a different approach than what they usually take. So I won't steal the thunder. They're going to share with you what they've found and what they do. But I think other police officers and police departments around the world we're really interested in hearing the results because they're very practical on paper, very easy to think about and to do, obviously very difficult to manage and to deliver, but it's a straightforward plan, and I think you'll find it interesting. So we'll start with John Daly, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Barak, and thank you, everybody. It's an absolute privilege to be here speaking with you in a room that I sat in 2014. That fundamentally changed my view of policing more than any single other event. And I think it's an absolutely fabulous programme. I think it's the future of law enforcement in the UK. And it's, as I say, it's an absolute honour to be here. Barak asked me how to present myself because he wasn't sure what to say. In simple terms, I joined West Midlands Police in 1999 and spent the first sort of 9 years as a local police constable, sergeant, inspector, working in some really diverse communities. And then sort of in the late noughties, about 2008, there were a number of high-profile counter-terrorism operations in Birmingham that were carried out really successfully in terms of mitigating the threat, but absolutely terribly in terms of how they did it in a way that appeared to be legitimate. And in short, drove a cart and horses through community cohesion and caused all sorts of problems. And I was therefore invited to go into counter-terrorism to look at that. From there, I became the head of investigation for counter-terrorism in the West Midlands. And then in 2013, as you may be aware, the government launched the concept strategy for organised crime, copying the terrorism strategy. And I've been asked to go and become the serious organised crime lead for West Midlands Police later in the Rocky, which is what this will be about in a moment, prevent really. But I'm currently the Director of Investigations for the National Crime Agency. And as I say, it's a pleasure to be here. So in terms of the context, the national context of what we're going to talk about today, we're talking about prevention, not cure. A, because it's the right thing to do, B, because it's cheaper, C, because it's safer. And trying to work out how we stop organised crime from happening in the first place. So just a little bit of sort of national context, really. Serious organised crime is a tier 2 national security threat. And one of the key and most significant growing areas of serious organised crime, cybercrime, is a tier 1 threat. The estimated financial cost has risen from over 20 billion in 2011 to over 37 billion today. And that's fueled by a lot of very entrepreneurial organised crime groups seizing opportunities and maximising them. So there's both an increase in the number of groups operating this way, but there's also an increasing number of threats and opportunities, particularly in the online space. And I think most importantly, and perhaps the real mirror to policing, was the Home Office Committee on Public Accounts, really, that effectively said, we need to stop just looking at how we pursue criminals and work out how we stop crime from happening in the first place. As I'm sure members of this audience would agree, it's not quite as easy to sell to law enforcement, actually showing the evidence for what works to inform practice, as opposed to basing it purely on professional judgment. In terms of the specific research setting where this research took place, it took place in the West Midlands police area, partly because I was a member of staff in West Midlands Police at the time, but also justifiably so because it was the area of the country that was the second highest threat in terms of serious organised crime, and the second highest threat in terms of counter-terrorism. And interestingly, at that time, you had 3 wards in the east of Birmingham that were both the most vulnerable for terrorism, the most vulnerable for organised crime, the most vulnerable for acquisitive crime, had the lowest level of employments in the region, had the lowest attainment rates at school, had the highest incidence of single children, and the list goes on, all within 3 very, very small wards. And the overriding view at the time was that terrorism and organised crime were not linked. And as Chief Constable Chris Vassin said, it just cannot be that we've got this conveyor belt of problems in 3 such distinctly small areas, and they're all just happening unrelated to each other. And with the assistance of Barrett, we did some research on behalf of Christopher Sims and found that in the West Midlands, not necessarily nationally, in those 3 wards, although it was true that organised criminals and terrorist groups were not involved in joint enterprise, they were all feeding off the same illicit financial markets, and they were all fishing in the same pool in terms of new recruits, which is where this prevent work will go. So that was the research statement. So it's therefore important in terms of the fact that not only is it linked to reducing the threat from organised crime, it's linked to reducing the threat from SOC, and it's linked to actually improving the livelihoods of people who are born into some very, very poor areas. Excuse me. So then we go on to the social case of prevention. So when I moved from terrorism into organised crime, it's like, well, yeah, but we've only got so many detectives, and the police force is certainly not awash with money. So the police's job, well, we put them in prison. That's why we've got social workers, that's why we've got local councillors. Well, actually, as again, I'm sure many people in this room will know, the first PDM principle is the prevention of crime and disorder. And the test of an efficient service is our ability to achieve that, not the visible evidence that we're trying to deal with it. So it runs to the very heart of it. And if any of you have been to Hendon Police Training College, there is a picture at the back of the dining room from Victorian times, where you've got an old Victorian police officer, and he's carrying a small child away from deprivation and taking him towards the hospital. So this is not a new thing, but somewhere along the way, we've moved away from helping people into a lot of people that just focus on enforcement, and we need to move back. The other case of prevention is that, as we know, sort of in West Midlands Police, there are 2,000 plus members of the OCG community on the organised crime mapping tool, less than 250 in prison, and only 10 of them on lifelong offender. So we clearly cannot arrest our way out of this problem. And what we found without any shadow of a doubt is that, like any other business, and this, let's make no mistake about it, this is a multi-billion-pound industry, there is no business that if you took the head out, they just stop. There's too much money to be made, and they've baked that in. So if you put the head of an OCG into prison, they will continue to operate. I'm sorry, finally, what we would say is that doesn't mean there's no prevent work going on. There was prevent work going on. But it was very localized, and there was no evidence. There was a lot of cherry picking. So there were a lot of places where you have somebody who used to be a gang member in Birmingham. They sort of come and help other gang members in Birmingham, and they do some good work on a one-to-one basis. But there was no evidential analysis as to whether it was working or not. It was just a good case study. And also, a lot of the problems that were faced with some of this prevent work is it was very much focused on removing vulnerability. And one of the most interesting pieces that we kind of found out when we looked at this research is we spoke to some of the people on the edge of organised crime groups and kind of said, well, what would it be like if we got you an apprenticeship in barbershop, for example, which is one of the sort of employment pathways to desistance when it comes to acquisitive crime, and was very successful for us. And he said, why would I want an apprenticeship in a barbershop when I earn £1,600 a week dealing drugs? So we knew that we needed a different solution. In terms of how we shaped it and the kind of criminological basis, some of the key learning I took from my MSc that I thought was relevant to this was firstly situational action theory. Because serious and organised crime is such a broad church, it's not one type of offending driven by pure ideology. There's a lot of different people, different backgrounds, different genders, different skill sets. So we needed some sort of theoretical basis that could cater for a broad range of criminality. And for me, situational action theory did that really well, because we could look at how different people's propensity and criminogenic exposure change their offending levels, either by a group eroding their self-control or by creating a psychological shift. Also, we wanted to move away from the individual-based approach where we just tried to find the most serious offenders or the most serious organised crime group and try and eradicate them or eradicate their offending, because a lot of law enforcement practitioners have tried it and have failed. And the best example would be everybody talked about Al Capone and the successes all these years later. The fact is, his organised crime group continues to operate today. So we needed to move away from the high priority offenders and actually try to look at who is it in this network that actually has a disproportionate effect and is more difficult to replace in order that we can target them and neutralise them. And in terms of that, one of the places that we began to look based on the work of Ashley Englefield and Maastricht and Farrington was the recruiters, the people that were actually going in and bringing people into the organised crime group. And the sort of lazy example that I give, because I just haven't found a better one, is I kind of like to look at it in an Oliver Twist sense, is we've got the Fagans at the top that are too far away and we can't catch them. We've got the young Oliver Twists, and it's the Artful Dodgers that are going out there recruiting new members, bringing them in, that is the lifeblood for the organised crime group, and that is the group that we were trying to, or that was the recruitment link that we were trying to break. What we kind of, again, without going into it too much, clearly, because it's such a broad church, because there's the organised crime crosses different cities, boundaries, social dynamics, heritages, etc., everybody's radicalisation route or recruitment route is different, and it would be impossible to try and tailor something. All we needed to do was to find a group of people that we thought were the most vulnerable and most likely future offenders, and then work out a programme that we could deliver in a consistent way. So, in simple terms, we were trying to, I was told to look at one of the three T's, we were trying to look at all of them. So, Shervin's triple T approach to evidence-based policing. Firstly, how do we target the power few in the group to have a disproportionate effect and reduce the harm they cause? Secondly, how do we test the effect of intervention so that we don't fall into the trap that I just referred to, whereby we have a good case study, we feel good about ourselves, and we move on, because we need the evidence to know whether or not we can industrialise the tactics. And actually, it was what will be the effect that we have on the recruits, the recruiters, and the organised crime group as a whole, as I will come on to. And finally, most importantly, tracking the delivery of the plans, because for quite a disciplined organisation and for a kind of a group of people of which I'm one that like to know, impose and follow the law, trying to tell a police officer to do something they don't want to do is a very, very difficult thing. And if there's a past police resistance, they are very, very good at finding it because they've been practicing it for roughly 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for however many years. Peter Nehru described it as the Bates effect, which was there was a turning point experiment in Western police that people might know as a fabulous randomised control trial. The only problem was one particular custody sergeant had a case and he didn't feel she randomly assigned and just chose for himself, thereby undermining the project. So it's how do we make sure that everything we say we do, so that we can have confidence that we're informing policymakers with best evidence. So in terms of how we develop the preventive approach, as I touched on, we recognised that there was no single cause, but effectively prevention occurs when an individual has a motive, an offence occurs when an individual has either a motive or desire. And some of the main motives in organised crime are money, sexual gratification, belief in the cause, or just a sense of belonging. So we needed something that would be able to tailor the programme to every individual, regardless of where they came from. And in short, what we did, just to kind of cut to the chase, is we visited each individual and we sat down with them and we explained to them in a specific way why we knew they were involved in organised crime. So it wasn't just a generic, we think you're up to no good. We were really clear on why we knew what they knew. And we explained to them where we thought their offending path was going to be going left unchecked. And then we tried to speak to them and we trained them with some third-party providers. The genuine hand of friendship is, how can we help to stop you? Is there a vulnerability? Is there something you need for assistance? And we'll come on to some of those results. And if there isn't, then you need to know that the likelihood of you being caught in future has increased because we now know who you are and we will be monitoring you. And if you're arrested in the future, we will come back and we will continue to offer this hand of friendship. But we are now in a partnership with you until such time as your offending ceases or reduces. In terms of how we tested whether it would work, we adopted a randomised control trial, generally recognised as the gold standard of investigation because it begins to enable us to look at cause and inference. And essentially, we had to do a lot of work to kind of safeguard cross-contamination. So effectively, we had an organised crime population of circa 2,500 people in the West Midlands. We did the random assignment of the entire OCG to avoid treatment contamination across the two. We found that more reliable than the simple before or after analysis. The sample size was much higher than was needed just to kind of give us the best and most reliable results. There are a number of ethical considerations. Closely after the hardest thing to do in RCG, closely after trying to get officers to do what they don't want to do, is to actually go through the ethical considerations of this. It's very, very significant. First one is whether or not it's right to use the OCGM mapping tool that policing use to actually identify your candidates, because without spending half an hour now, there is unconscious bias in terms of what goes into OCGM. And the problem is, once you've got bias in the intelligence tool that drives police practice, police officers then go and look in that place and you end up with confirmation bias. So it is far from a perfect tool. And it also only deals with the known knowns without going into Romsdale. However, we believe that on balance, the importance of the experiment as such and the reliability of the OCG was sufficient that it was worthy of using that as the best mapping tool. But what we did is we complemented it with getting arrest data from PNC. So we combined OCGM and arrest data to try and mitigate some of the biases in that system. We're also really mindful of a possible backfiring effect in terms of, firstly, there's a chance that we go and knock on someone's door and we're wrong because the intelligence is wrong. And secondly, there's the chance that we go and knock on the door and we tell them something and they react negatively to it, either because they don't trust us or because they don't agree with us. And actually then there's the kind of all sorts of things such as labelling, labelling, changing their self-perception of themselves and actually just doing the opposite to what the police want. And it was also important, what we didn't do was actually loosen or reduce the effectiveness of the pursue law enforcement response and actually have otherwise dangerous criminals being given a soft touch and a prevent treatment. So we set an exclusion criteria in terms of persons too dangerous, people under 16, and people that were already involved in another major treatment, for example, lifetime offender management. We then had a kind of independent community group as an ethics committee and sat with them with representatives from across the city so that they could kind of quality assure our work, give us challenges and helped us to shape it. And were really good actually in terms of helping us to shape how we went and visited these people in a way that would maximise their trust in us. And so that was a very, very valuable exercise. This is just an example of essentially what we did is we took PNC data and OCGM data and created a network analysis of all of the different organised crime groups. And what we were trying to identify were the blue nodes, which we will call the recruiters or the Oliver Twists, whereby these were people who were a member of, who intelligence indicate were a member of an OCG. They've been arrested in the last 12 months, and they've been arrested with a different member of the same OCG that was older than them, drawing on some of the eligibility criteria from the studies I've already touched upon. And based on that, we then came up with a cohort of individuals. And we developed initially 3 programs. The idea is to have 3 programs. 200 would be a control group, 200 would be the police-led prevent program I described to you, and 200 would be allocated to a third sector provider to provide ostensibly the same prevent program, but where the likelihood of trust between the group and the provider was likely to be higher, so probably a better carrot, but maybe not the stick. Unfortunately, we were unable to find a provider to deliver that for us. Number of different reasons, a number of different providers, but in short, none of them had the confidence to take on the population or the group that we gave them. They wanted to be able to cherry pick their own individuals, and they wanted to be able to choose their own success outcomes using case studies and wouldn't subject themselves to the randomized control methodology. So in the end, we reduced it to just the police and treatment group. Each program ran for 12 months, individually obtained disruptions as we talked about, and all results captured by a tablet so that we could have a thorough record of everything that had taken place and monitor that all activity that we said should be done was done. In terms of treatment integrity, I will have to read this bit, I'm afraid, because so between 68 and 78% of people either undertook the treatment or knew we were trying to locate them. And what that meant was we'd either knock on the door and we met them, or we'd knock on the door and we'd speak to a mum, and then the mum would come back and say, oh yes, yeah, he knows you're looking for you, but he's trying to avoid us. We cannot actually determine how many of the people were passively made unaware of it. And following all of the contacts, we completed a questionnaire and went through all of the steps I talked about earlier and recorded it onto Corvus. And then as part of that, any of the referrals that were asked for, we made a referral to. Interestingly, only 20 to 25% of individuals supported or requested support. And those that did, very, very few of them took it up thereafter. Our working hypothesis was, when speaking to the officers and when looking at the questionnaire results, is that if they felt that we would go away quicker if they agreed to the pathway, then they'd agree to it, but they actually had no intention of really going to it. And it marries up with the description I gave you earlier. Very few of these people saw themselves as vulnerable or requiring accommodation, employment, etc. And in terms of the recruits, as I say, there are 235 in the control group, which is business as usual, 219 in the police-led prevent program, and 219 in the third-party group. There's a baseline comparability that I won't go through, and the OCG the same. And in terms of the results, what we found was that there was a 57% reduction in reoffending amongst the population that received police treatment compared to the control group. And then in terms of the organised crime group, at an organised crime level, we increased the number of arrests. I was explaining this incorrectly. We increased the number of total arrests against the OCG in that period. Now that's a really sort of important point from a police officer's point of view, maybe less so sort of criminologically, but the conventional wisdom in policing, and particularly organised crime policing, is that if you've got a covert operation, what you don't want anyone to do is know anything. So I've seen sort of covert detectives, I've been one myself, is you gather all this information about the group, you're looking to take out the top 1 or 2 people, and everything you guard furiously because you're worried that if anything gets out, or if anything spooks the group, that they'll go to the ground and you'll never ever be able to catch them. This provided a really important counter-narrative, and I'll explain why I think it did. Is actually, if you deliver the prevent and the pursue activity alongside each other, it's really, really effective because it reduces the offending of the low-level recruits and recruiters, and it actually draws out the main offenders, so they actually go hands-on themselves, and I'll turn to that shortly. Because that's what you can see here. Essentially, this breaks it down by the affiliation in where the arrests increased. And what we found was that the recruits reduced their offending, the recruiters reduced their offending, and the main man kind of sat back and sent his number 2 out. So what was happening is we were generating distrust amongst the group. They didn't know who to trust apart from their closest members, and so they made their closest members undertake the activity rather than let some of the lower level affiliates do the work that they ordinarily would. So as I say, it's a case of doing this work, multiplying it over the top of the covert. So, and this is, I credit Barrett on this slide because I don't have to put a photograph. I think we will smoke them out their holes, and we will basically create mistrust. These are groups that have been, most of these groups have been in existence for over 10 years, way over 10 years. And they're not used to this. And I think this is an important part of it. Whether it would last forever, who knows? But they are not used to this activity, and so it creates distrust, and it calls them out so we can arrest them. So the findings are that the approach works. The third sector interventions are challenging, and I've never discounted it. I've been a police officer, as I say, for a significant period of time. I do believe third sector interventions are crucially important if there is a specific problem you have in a localised area, and you've got a provider in that area that is very niche. But what I haven't found evidence of is a third sector provider that is able to work across different geographies, because they tend to be too reliant on the specific characteristics of people in one area in order to be effective. And generally speaking, they don't subject themselves to the right amount of evidential vigor that would enable you to move some pursuit resource, for example, into a prevent space. Also, in this case, it's the unwillingness of offenders to engage. In essence, virtually nobody, when we knocked on the door, went, yeah, you're right, actually. What everybody said was a combination of, you're completely wrong. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not involved in the organised crime group at all. Or, yeah, I used to do that, but that was like years ago. I've grown up since then. And these people are good at convincing them, convincing the police officer. It got to the point where, as Barrett would know, I was very nervous because all the police officers come back and this is rubbish. We're all wrong people. They completely convinced the cops that these were innocent individuals, not involved in organised crime. And as cops like to do, they like to moan about the supervisor. They're going, that Denny bloke doesn't know what he's on about. He sent us along to these people's houses, and I don't know what we're talking about. But the data shows that they were active offenders and that they were offending reduced. So my point is the third sector intervention, where it's all based on trust of what you're saying, is slightly undermined in the organised crime space. The third finding was that deterrence and desistance messages work, and we see the behavioural effect. The 57% reduction in offending that we targeted, I talked about, while at the same time increasing arrests by the OCGs. Our conclusions and working hypothesis is it is the psychological impact of the police visiting the cohort that has the most significant effect in terms of reducing offending, partly because they think that we know something, partly because we've imposed on them or explained to them with credibility that the likelihood of them being caught quickly for any future offending is increased. So we've changed the risk matrix for them. And it had an impact, even though we know the officers didn't have confidence that it worked, that the subjects convinced the officers that we're in the wrong place. It worked even though we were unable to contact over 20%, and that only 40 trigger pans were in place. And that last point, I think, is really important, because what it means is this isn't a fabulously complex tactic, like, for example, sort of normal ION offender management programs, where you've got a very finite number of people you can deliver an offender management program to in a conventional acquisitive crime space, because oftentimes they're offending out of vulnerability or addiction, and therefore they do need employment, they do need education, they do need support to feed themselves, they do need support to come off their drugs. And all of this support is needed, and therefore you need a lot of resource, and there's a limited time people can help. Actually, because we don't need the pathways, you can actually adopt and adapt this tactic really quickly and get it off the ground in short order. And for example, following this, we have used it in the West Midlands. If there's a spike in a particular type of offending, we will just deliver this tactic just to put an instant suppression effect on. There's also no need for additional intelligence or pursuit tactics to wrap around this. So you don't need a huge team. It wasn't like some of the other studies that we read, where effectively not only were people visited, but then there was like a dedicated team that was just focused on that person watching them. We don't need that. We just need a small number of people sufficient to do the visits, but also with the right training, which is probably beyond the scope of this presentation, but I'm happy to take questions. In short, all you need is a reliable list of targets, the priority you're looking to tackle, a clear script, and a confident officer. And if there are two things that I sort of say maximize it, is the more specific you can be about what you know and why you know it and what's coming next, and the more clearly you can deliver that message, the better. And if you've got intelligence where you know they're going to be at a certain time that isn't where you think they will be, then go there. So for example, one of the most effective ones is there was one lad who used to, sort of after they sort of played football together, before he went back to his girlfriend's house, he went to somebody else's house. And we just waited for him outside that house. I was like, what are you doing here? So actually being careful about where you meet them, what you say, and why you're saying it. And that was just on 30 minutes, a summary of the study that we took. So I'm very grateful if you listened to me. I hope you're interested. If there are questions, I'll take them. Oh,
Yes, thank you.
So good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me all right? Yep. So good evening. My name is Lee Hill, the Chief Superintendent, and I head up a team called the Violent Crime Task Force in London. Essentially, our main remit is tackling workplace violence, which includes ranges from offences such as homicide all the way down to GBH stabbings, and basically all offending involving violence. I've no doubt most of you will be aware of the challenges we currently have in London. But just to sort of give you some context, I'm going to take a slightly different approach to what John's done tonight, because tonight really I just wanted to sort of share with you my personal reflection on having implemented this trial in London, talk about some of the challenges that we've had, and then also talk about my insight and certainly the learning that I've got from this, because hopefully this can be a platform to encourage others to tonight to look at focused deterrence, because I'm a big fan of focused deterrence and I think it's the way forward. So just a little bit of context for you. So last year we had the highest number of teenage homicides on record, 31 since 2008, and that doesn't include all the near misses. We know with the advances now in medical science, a lot more people can be saved. A lot of my officers are actually been performing chest compressions out on the street, and I hear that an awful lot from cops that I speak to. So the reality is that far more people would die if it wasn't for medical science and interventions. So we've got a real problem in London, and it's one that we need to meet head on. And we can put lots of cops out there. Professor Sherman obviously is aware of experiment we also ran in London called Operation Avert, where we put cops basically on lots of street corners, but it didn't have the effect that we so desired. So what we did was basically look at other operations, other alternatives, and obviously this was a particular operation that we did that supported and complemented that. And I can talk more broadly about what we're doing in London, learning from all these different experiences. But Operation Naples, I can move the slide on, like it's still showing John's slide. I haven't got as many slides as John, you'd be pleased to know. Right, so the title of the experiment was knocking on doors and offering London offenders at risk of violence support, randomized control trial. So, as I said, we decided to do this, and having spent 30 years in policing, doing a variety of roles, I've seen firsthand some of the challenges that my staff face. And this is a really critical issue for us in London, particularly, especially involving young people, because it's a sad fact that too many young people, particularly young black men, are disproportionately affected by knife crime and violence in general. So we really wanted to do something different. So we basically, in collaboration with Cambridge, we got together, we worked it through in terms of what could we do that actually something unique in the sense has never been tried before, but actually would make a real impact on people's lives. So the idea being was, does a preventative knock on the door for repeat offenders involved in both knife and gun crime reduce victimisation and future crime harm compared to control convictions? And it was very much a carrot and stick approach. So looking at lots of the learning from Professor David Kennedy, the Project Shield that was done in London many years ago, looking at John's work that he'd done in West Midlands and others. We incorporated all that into Operation Naples, which was a 6-stroke, 3-month operation. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail why that was challenging. And even tonight, Barrett has shared some of the outcomes with me, which I won't reveal now because it's a surprise at the end. But you know, some real strong positive indications, I think it's fair to say, that actually this particular operation had a real deterrent effect. So I just wanted to talk about some of the challenges. So I think in any operation or any trial, and John's touched on treatment fidelity, and I think you need to make sure you have adequate preparation. You can't simply expect a group of police officers, and John's already said, you know, cops aren't always the most reliable, to go and deliver deterrent messages. So there was a lot of thought process that went into this, particularly around the script that they were being used, the officers who were actually delivering those messages. Now, I was fortunate enough to be able to reach out to the whole of the Met Police, so that's like 30,000 people, to support me in this particular operation. But what we identified fairly quickly was that the people who had the skill set to be able to deliver those messages were the IOM officers, the integrated offender management officers, because they were doing this regularly. And what we were concerned about is actually if we started to use other people, then it would almost dilute the messaging that was being delivered. So we managed to train up a cohort of officers that were able to do this, to make sure that the messages were being consistent in their delivery. Also, we looked at the times of days as well, and the actual setting in which these messages were being delivered as well. And I'll talk about that more broadly, because that was almost an experiment in itself in some respects, because what we found was actually there was enough time to do these sort of visits. I don't know whether that was something that you experienced from your particular experiment, but we could almost say, actually, if you do the visit at these particular times of the day, that is when you're most likely to optimize success. So we trained up a cohort of officers using IOM officers, and we were very clear about the messaging. It was simply put, we really want to help you. We understand that you're at risk from violence. And actually, the data supported that. We even shared that data and said, look, you have been the victim of a stabbing in the last 12 months, or you've been a suspect as well, or a knife offence. We really want to help you, and this is your opportunity to exit that lifestyle, you know, to exit a gang's lifestyle or to support yourself. And some of the responses were overwhelming. I know John's talked about the willingness of people to engage, and maybe I was just lucky with my experiment, I don't know, but certainly some of the stories that we got back from the officers was just, I mean, it's heartbreaking for one, to hear these young people tell their stories about how they became involved in knife crime, how they got mixed up with gangs and everything else. But just to hear them say, look, I'm so pleased that you've come and seen me. I've been waiting for this night in the door. And it was that moment of relief. In fact, someone had taken the trouble, the time and the effort to reach out to him and say, look, we really want to help you. And too often, I don't know whether this is experiences for you, John, or others in policing, but too often I hear a lot of my colleagues say, well, they're so far gone, they're not reachable, or we can't do anything for them. Well, I don't think you should give up on any young person, in particular person. That's just my policing philosophy. But certainly what we found in this particular experiment was a lot of people were waiting for that opportunity almost to cleanse themselves and say, look, we really want to turn our lives around. And this is that moment, this is that turning point. And we're so glad that we've taken the trouble today. So we were sort of very clear in terms of how we were going to do it, particularly around the messaging. So I just want to sort of touch on the eligibility criteria. And I talked about knife and gun crime. So what we did effectively was take a cohort of people. We took those who'd been suspect in a knife offence in the last 12 months, as well as being a victim of knife crime as well. And we also included in that people who've been subjected to gun crime or have been a suspect in the gun crime as well. So you can see the figures that we've started off with. So in terms of enrolment, you've got something like, well, 30,000 people, you know, who've been stabbed, shot. And it was interesting because when we started out on this, and we managed to sort of get the number down to a more reasonable figure, when we looked at sort of exclusion criteria and everything else, 3 of those people had sadly been killed in that year. So we knew we were looking at the right people. And that was a real bonus because I wasn't sure about when we started the experiment, whether the criteria that we were using was right for the situation we were in. But clearly it was, because a number of people had sadly lost their lives. So we removed people that have been subjected to domestic violence. We also removed other vulnerabilities as well. And we ended up with a cohort of 214, which was nice because it evenly split between control and treatment, 107. And then I suppose it was one of those moments where you're sitting down and then you're reflecting, okay, so I've got this great experiment. I've got my cohort of people that we're going to treat. But actually, how do I get senior management buy-in? I don't know whether you had these experiences on your experiment. Certainly trying to sell this as a concept, as an idea, to senior management within the Met Police wasn't easy. And Professor Sherman has just joined our ranks and he knows exactly what I'm talking about. But whenever you're trying to sell something new, it's really hard. And I was having lots of conversations with all sorts of different people. And there was clearly, let's say, a reluctance to do this for lots of different reasons. There were concerns around risk factors. Would it expose these people unnecessarily? The fact that we were going around to their home addresses, would they be called snitches, grasses? You know, so many of the terminologies we use. So all these things we had to contend with. But it was certainly trying to get that initial buy-in was proving to be difficult. And eventually we managed to convince, I think, the right people. We also had a big challenge with the ethics committee as well, which Barak and I had the pleasure of presenting this to. And there were all sorts of challenges around that, which thankfully we managed to overcome, but that's probably for another day. But it was really hard just to sell this as an idea, as a concept, to say, look, this is something we really want to do. And ultimately, and a phrase that Al Murray, hopefully most people know Al Murray, a phrase Al Murray was commonly used whenever we would present this particular experiment to others, is that this is your kill or be killed list, because these people are clearly, not only are they the most risky, but they're the most vulnerable in society. So I would commonly use that phrase, and a lot of people would scratch their heads and think, what's he talking about? Well, actually, they are, because we knew that, because 3 had already been killed when we started to look at the data. So what we in effect ended up with was a cohort of people who are clearly violent people in their own right, but clearly at risk and vulnerable as well. So over the preceding sort of 6 weeks, we went out, we did, each individual had 3, a minimum of 3 visits. Some of these people were located outside of London. They'd actually been relocated because for their own safety, because they were at risk of remaining in London. Some of them were also incarcerated in prison. So again, all these sort of issues trying to contend with in terms of, well, how do you do a visit in prison? I don't know if you had that on yours, but you know, just trying to get prison authorities to agree to allow us to go in and speak to people was a real challenge. But just a quick story with you. So one young man, he'd been stabbed 3 times. He'd been a suspect for a shooting. He was on bail for a murder. He got relocated all the way up to Peterborough. They had to send this young man, he was 17. And I had this dilemma, what do? He's in my treatment group, or I just dismiss it, or You know, and I thought, well, do you know what? No, I'm not going to dismiss it. So we sent officers all the way up to Peterborough. And I'm sure they had a lovely time going up to Peterborough, especially as an overnighter. But anyway, they went up and saw this young man. And, you know, he welcomed them with open arms. You know, they bought him some shopping, some food, because he had no food in his fridge. And just that one moment, that interaction, just changed that young man's perspective, not just of police officers, particularly police officers in London, but just people willing to help him. Because as far as he was concerned, to them, he was a lost cause. No one was interested. There was no family figures around him. No one loved him. The only people that he could relate to in that moment in time were those officers, my officers, in plain clothes. So it really goes to show, actually, the worthwhile of doing these type of experiments, but also understanding the challenges, because it's not straightforward as simple as going to deliver a script to a person and then going on knocking on someone else's door. It really has to be carefully thought through. And we did have some instances where the parents would be present in the room. And I call it the vicarious effect. So the parent would be sat in the room, we deliver the message to the individual, and then the parent would say, look, I'm here. Would you mind just speaking to my son, my daughter? I'm really worried about them because they're mixed up in gangs. So we had this vicarious effect. Not only were we delivering these deterrence messages to a cohort of risky individuals, but we also had this other subset, other people that were coming into us to say, look, this is great. We really want this. How can we be part of this experiment? How can we be involved in it? So we did end up with a lot of young people, particularly young siblings, being referred into us, which was great. And we were able to support them as well through their journey. Something I just want to touch on, and it's John triggered thought, actually, a memory, because we use lots of service providers. And if I sort of reflect on where I felt we could have done better, or the experiment could be improved in the future, was having that assurance that those service providers would commit, but also see through their promises, because a lot of young people in particular were being referred, and then we would follow up in a few months' time and find out actually they haven't been supported, which was a real shame and a lost opportunity. So we're just in the process of starting a new experiment very similar to Naples in London, where we're looking to use the Prince's Trust. And effectively, geographically, they're all over the UK. So I'm sort of hoping, in a way, although the programs that they offer aren't necessarily geared for everyone, hopefully we'll be able to use them to deliver a consistent program of intervention, not just to young people, but also adults as well. And I think that's probably one of the big learnings from this particular experiment. But in terms of, so talk about treatment fidelity, talking about vicarious effect, talking about harm to play. So interestingly, and we haven't really looked at this data yet, although we've got it. I was intrigued to, so one of the questions I asked my team is, what is the most optimum time or the optimum setting in which to do the visit? Because it'd be great, wouldn't it, for me to go and tell the new commissioner, you know what, boss, actually, if you get all your cops doing visits this time of day, in these particular circumstances, you will manage to convince a lot of young people in particular that actually, there are opportunities outside of crime or gangs. So we really wanted to try and optimize when the best time is to do the visits. And certainly from the data that we've looked at, certainly mornings seem to be more successful than afternoons and in the night time. And interestingly, when we're able to get access into the house, the actual messaging was more effective as well, because a lot of people were, no, you can't come in, you can talk to me on the doorstep type of thing. And what we found is actually when we got through the threshold, got over the threshold and actually sat down with the person, their parent or guardians in the room as well, the message was stronger, it was being delivered, it was being listened to, and it was actually more receptive. So I think there's definitely some opportunities here in terms of looking at what is the most optimum time to do a visit, or sorry, optimum setting. And one of the other things we looked at as well was the makeup of the officer doing the visit. So was the offer of acceptance more inclined to be taken up because the officer was female? And we certainly saw that, a really strong indication that when the message was being delivered by a female officer, it was more likely to be accepted. I don't know if that was something with yours, but we started to look at all the other data. I love data, fascinated by it. And I think, for me, we talk a lot about how we harness data in policing, how we use it to be more data driven. Professor Sherman's obviously coming into the net to build that philosophy. But certainly for me, there were so many opportunities, not just looking at the visit themselves, but how we then use that data going forward. So I'm going to now turn to the outcomes. And I think there's a couple of things that I probably would say is obviously these are 6 months results. So we've obviously got a 12-month evaluation, but what we are seeing is some really strong indications. So in terms of repeat victimization, so we're looking at a 26% reduction in repeat incidents, which equates to a 10% reduction in overall pain harm index. And again, in terms of actual numbers, that's 6,031, which I think, by all accounts, that's a really strong indication. And I think it just goes to show what can be achieved when you do these types of experiment. And then if we actually break it down even further, and again, I think this is fascinating. So if we look at our under 18s, there's a mix of adults and juveniles, and it's roughly similar, 37 in the treatment group, 33 in the control. You can see it's a massive reduction, 61% repeat incidents. Again, equated to a 49% reduction in CHI, overall 10,000. So if we just sort of compare that with pain harm index, and I know most of you are familiar with that in terms of, prison days, time spent in prison, that equates to 2 homicides. So we prevented 2 homicides by doing these visits. I mean, personally, I know it's my experiment, I'm pretty biased, but I think that's outstanding. I really do. And I know I'm standing here taking all the credit for it. To be honest, it's people like Barrack and others who's obviously supported me in doing this, as well as a really good team around me who bought into it. But I think given the findings that we're seeing tonight, 2 homicides prevented, 7 GBHs, 27 robberies, 5,000 common assaults. This has got to be the way forward. We need to see more of this type of experiments, which is why in London, we're looking now to embark on a new one, which is sort of taking some of the learning from Naples, but also incorporating some other bits as well, particularly some of the work that John's done, some of the work that Dave Cowan's done in New Zealand. Dave and I had the pleasure of presenting some of our work last week at the Oval with Alex Murray. And I think we've started to build quite a network of sort of focused deterrence believers, haven't we? It's almost like this mission, this crusade that we're now on. And as I said, I genuinely think this is the way forward, particularly for policing. And it's just interesting, some of your sort of thoughts and perspectives on where we go. But for me personally, having done 30 years of policing, knocking on lots of people's doors and arresting people, it's more than that. It's the way we do it. It's all in the messaging. And I think for me, this is probably a moment where we can all reflect and say, actually, we've done a really good job. And I think just to finish on one point, if I may very quickly. So when I got all the team together, there was about 30 of us. There was a big effort. The feedback that they gave me in terms of their personal experience as well. So we talked about how it's changed a lot of people's lives, how young people have been affected by it. Actually, the cops themselves, the feedback that they were giving us, look, boss, this is amazing. Look, why are we doing this? We should be doing more of this. And we did have some real challenges because they actually wanted to have more people on their list and saying, look, Lee Hill, we should have him onto this, or Barrack area, we should have him onto this. Well, no, you've got to keep it sterile for lots of different reasons. So I think it wasn't so hard for me to sort of sell this as an idea. And it's interesting just sort of listening to your presentation about some of the challenges you had. But I think initially, once we got over that initial reluctance, particularly on the senior management side, in terms of the officers that were going out doing this on a sort of day-to-day basis, they actually believed in what we were doing. And I think it's interesting, particularly when we talk about integrated offender management, what that does that actually mean? What does that actually mean? A lot of people ask me that question. Well, I think there's a lot of learning opportunities with this that we can take forward. And as John said, we cannot risk our way out of the problem, particularly in London. We have huge challenges. I mean, this weekend alone, we've had 5 homicides in London. You know, it's really critical for us. And I think the way forward is obviously these type of experiments as well as others that we're doing in London. And I think there's so much scope and opportunity with it. But I think that's probably where I'll end it, if that's okay, because I'm conscious that we want to give time for questions. But yeah, thank you very much.
Time for questions in just a minute, but I have the privilege of discussing what you just heard, and I want to raise some questions. Beautiful. Yeah. No, you did actually. Somebody did. Anyway, just a couple of reflections about your talks and about focused deterrence more broadly. I think one of the major differences between an engagement with an offender when you arrest them and engaging with an offender when you're not arresting them is entirely different. When you arrest somebody, they hate you, they blame you, they don't like you. So try to get a meaningful conversation at that moment of time seems completely fruitless. I don't think, as far as I can tell, it's very challenging to change somebody's opinion about the police, let alone try to change their lives at the moment of arrest. So there's a huge difference between this focused deterrence approach, where you talk to people in a calm way, in a way that tries to convey a genuine message. We're here to help. We're not here to arrest you. Now, of course, behind the scenes, there's a deterrence effect. We cannot ignore this. I mean, it's still a cop, whether civilian, clothed or not. The conversation is a lot about deterrence because they convey a message of deterrence. And that's fine. There shouldn't be a problem with that by itself. But the offer to help, I think, goes a long way. Now, frankly, we don't know how many of these kids or individuals actually took up on the services. We don't know very well. As John described, a lot of them said yes, but we never turned up or we never took up on the offer. But I think the offer itself is a meaningful sort of message that the cops are not that bad. And it's really important because, especially when you talk about young offenders or organized crime group offenders, or possibly organized crime group offenders in the future, there's a lot of distrust. So on the one hand, you have a strong deterrence message, which is the one consistent thing across the board in every one of these engagements. Because obviously, because people, as John described, different needs, different issues, and different reasons why they commit crime, the one consistent case that happened again and again was the deterrence message. We know who you are. We came to your house. And we didn't come to your house because of a particular background or because of because of your criminal behavior. And that's really important because it sends a message to this offender, you're on our radar now. So that, I think, is a critical message and something to think about when you talk about what is the intervention that we're actually doing here. I think the question of ethics came up a lot. Importantly so, of course, it came up a lot. How should we do this? Are we labeling people? And if there's any other force is thinking about doing something like this in the future, it should be critical for you to think about these things. Because not only are you going to get a lot of response from communities and from interest groups of why you're doing this, why you're labeling people and so on, you have a good reasoning for doing this. So, but thinking about the ethics behind this is critically important. We should think about this all the time. On the final bit, if I may, these are experiments, right? So we have results and see if it's working or not. But of course, crime and policing is not a zero-sum game. So you can go do an engagement and you talk to these offenders. So you plan to do 3 and you plan to do 3 as well. But then what happens after the 3rd engagement? So if you disappear, then there's a huge risk that it may be looked as a toothless intervention, because you said you're going to put them on the radar. You tell them they should be cautious because, hey, don't do what you do because we know who you are. But then if you disappear, there may be a backfiring effect. So on the one hand, it's very important to then look at the data maybe 3-4 years down the line. But it's also important to know that it's not going to end with just one sort of knock on the door. And with that, I'll end because, of course, there are a lot of questions and comments from the floor.